Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the a special joint community of practice between the policy professionals and the finance community of practice in New South Wales. So it's very exciting to have both communities of practice come together. I expect it will be a sellout crowd, but we'll see how we go. So as host of the our event today, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the lands of Aboriginal people, and I'm on Gadigal land here. And I will acknowledge the contribution of Aboriginal elders, past, present and emerging, and give a warm welcome to any Aboriginal people joining us today, and recognise the important economic, social and environmental contributions that Aboriginal people make to our world. And I'll just start by a bit of an introduction of our speakers today, and then I'll hand over to my colleagues from the finance community of practice. So we have two speakers. We have Atsushi Yamamoto, who's the Acting Executive Director in the Cabinet Office. He's responsible for the economic and finance portfolios at the moment, and he has 15 years experience in policy and strategy in the New South Wales government and in New South Treasury, where he was the Director of Infrastructure and Land Use Strategy, and he also worked at NSW Infrastructure New South Wales as Project Director, leading on the development of the state infrastructure strategy between 2022 to 2042. So warm welcome to Atsushi. And also we have Sam Walker, the Executive Director of the Budget Division, who is responsible for the oversight of the state budget process and advice on fiscal policy to the government. Sam's career spans the UK and New South Wales public services, and he's also worked in finance, banking reform and international development. So we have some great speakers along with you today. Now I'll pass over to John as well. Thank you.
Thanks ever so much, Louisa. It's great to have this first collaboration between our two communities of practice, and I'm really excited to think that it might be the first of many. For those whom I've not yet met, my name is John Jeffrey, JJ everyone calls me, and I am the new chair for the Community of Finance Professionals. I'd like to welcome all of our members to this Let's Get Fiscal event and quickly add my perspectives. What I challenge everyone on this call to do, both policy and finance professionals, is to consider and take away this question. When is the best time to collaborate between policy and finance teams? Is it after the policy has been fleshed out? Is it during the process of calculating costs? Or, as you'll probably pick up from the theme from our two presenters, is the best time to collaborate as early as possible? How can you be more effective and allow better informed decision making? How can you positively influence the early stages of policy development through developing the financial impact analysis, through to the Cabinet and ERC submissions and other key stages of the budget process? So keep those things in mind, please. But it's not about just questioning yourselves. We've got some great presenters, and it's my absolute pleasure to hand over to Atsushi Yamamoto, who's going to be our first presenter from the Cabinet Office. So over to you, Atsushi.
Thanks very much, John. Thanks very much, Louisa. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll just show my slides and get going in a moment. Here we go. Hopefully the slides are showing.
Yes, that's good.
Great. Okay. Thank you again for inviting me. My name is Atsushi Yamamoto. I'm currently Acting Executive Director, Economic Policy Branch at the Cabinet Office. So I've been asked to provide a little bit of an overview around the Cabinet Office's function, as well as I thought it might be helpful, while many of you on the call may already be familiar with the Cabinet process. I thought it's helpful to just do a little bit of a quick recap around that, and then I'll hand over to Sam Walker, who'll dive into a bit more around the budget process. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands in which we are meeting. I'm dialing in from Gadigal land, and I would like to pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging as well. So in terms of what I'll cover, I'll just go through a little bit around the different functions between the Premier's Department and the Cabinet Office. I'll talk a little bit around the Cabinet Office's purpose, as well as our org structure. I'll talk a little bit around the Cabinet and Cabinet conventions, which I think is helpful to just, again, put in the back of your mind, as well as the Cabinet submission process, which naturally has a very clear link to the budget process more broadly. So the Premier's Department and the Cabinet Office. So as many of you would be aware, the Premier's Department and the Cabinet Office commenced operation on 1st of July 2023. Prior to that, the two agencies operated under one department, the Department of Premier and Cabinet. Broadly speaking, so I understand we received questions around what is the difference between the Premier's Department and the Cabinet Office. And so with the Premier's Department, the purpose statement is connecting to deliver from the heart of government. And so broadly speaking, there are three functions in that context. One is that the PD leads the New South Wales Public Service by fostering a culture of service and collaboration, promoting strong public sector performance and promoting the voice of Aboriginal people and communities across the sector. So an example of that is the Aboriginal Affairs New South Wales agency, who focus on creating partnerships for economic growth, strengthening cultural identity and language, and creating and maintaining effective Aboriginal community governance with the Aboriginal communities. Oops. My slides have dropped off. I'll just pull it up again. So I may have accidentally shared their screen. Hopefully that's back on.
Thanks for that.
That's all right. So the second function for PD, broadly speaking, is that they ensure a whole of government response to urgent issues and crises by coordinating cross-agency responses to support our communities when they need it most. So an example, again, of that is emergency management, where PD coordinates the various emergency services like police and ambulance services and respond to things like natural disasters. And finally, PD also focuses on delivering and managing complex multi-agency projects aligned with government priorities and election commitments. On the other hand, the Cabinet Office, which is where I'm at, our purpose statement is leading policy, strategy, and integrity from the heart of government. So what does that mean a bit more specifically? So ultimately, we are here to support the Premier and Cabinet in their roles as decision makers by providing expert policy advice informed by data, evidence, consultation, and also a focus on the bigger picture. Being a central agency, we're able to think about the various dots, connect the various dots across the sector, and be able to advise the Premier and Cabinet from a whole of government perspective. And we do that, of course, in consultation with agencies. We also coordinate and at times actually lead policy reform and development to drive the government's priorities. So examples of that are where there are issues that are cross-agency in nature, things like housing affordability, for example, or the energy transition work. Whilst there are agencies who lead many of the policy technical expertise, the TCO provide a whole of government lens, given that there are so many dimensions of government involved in delivering some of those complex policy reform agendas. We're here to advance the state's interests at a national level, so we provide the strategic advice whenever there are intergovernmental decisions to be made, insofar as taking a New South Wales position and negotiating with other jurisdictions as well as with the Commonwealth, as well as local government. Importantly, we uphold cabinet conventions and good cabinet practice. So I'll get into a little bit more of that, but making sure that the process that are observed and that there's a strong high level of integrity around decision-making is made is quite crucial to ensure that the right people are consulted and our elected ministers can make decisions with as much informed advice as possible. And finally, we're also here to ensure that the government can deliver its agenda lawfully and effectively through the good governance and expert legal advice. So this is just a snapshot of the Cabinet Office in terms of its organisational structure. So broadly speaking, there are three groups. You'll see on the far left, there is definitely a strong focus on the General Counsel group, where the legal branch and also the Cabinet and Governance branches sit. So whenever there are decisions that require legislative change or regulatory change, our legal team works closely with the proponent agencies, but also for whole of government issues, our legal team would be the ones leading the submission to Cabinet around changes to legislation or regulation. The Cabinet and Governance branch plays a crucial role. So many of the protocols around things like appointments for committees and boards across New South Wales Government, again, the Cabinet Convention, the Cabinet Practice Manual, among others, those come out of the Cabinet and Governance branch. And then we have the Social Policy and Intergovernmental Relations group. So as you can see there, broadly speaking, there's a social policy branch, as well as health, education, intergovernmental and strategic priorities. And also Women New South Wales, which is the group that really promotes the gender equality agenda, also sits as part of the Social Policy and Intergovernmental Relations group. And finally, I'm part of the Economic and Environmental Policy group. So Economic Policy branch, we work a lot with Transport for New South Wales, DCIS and Treasury. So many of the whole of government major infrastructure decisions, as well as Treasury's whole of government initiatives. We work with them very closely. We have branches that interface on environment, energy and primary industry related matters. We have a branch that focuses on planning and housing reform. And we also have the Shaping Futures and Data Insights branch, who work again across the clusters on many data insights related initiatives, many of the whole of government initiatives, and help provide that evidence base for policy decision making. So just a quick kind of overview around Cabinet and Cabinet conventions, particularly for those who might not have had a lot of experience being involved in Cabinet submissions or Cabinet processes. So what is Cabinet? So ultimately, Cabinet is the forum where ministers discuss and decide issues of significance of the state and set the government's policy agenda, legislative program, and strategic direction. So this is not a legislated forum. This is run very much as part of customs within a Westminster-style system of government, like in New South Wales. So Westminster-style government being a democratic government elected by the people. Ministers have some terms around which they operate. So the Cabinet system and its operations evolved to allow the government to consider matters that reflect its particular circumstances and issues of importance to the community. So a well-functioning Cabinet system ensures that government decision makers are supported by high-quality submissions and advice from across the public sector. And Cabinet committees are chaired by the Premier. And by convention, the Cabinet Office Secretary acts as the Secretariat for Cabinet, which is partly why TCO plays a strong role in providing the advice to Cabinet across a range of issues. And broadly speaking, there are three Cabinet conventions to mention. So there's the collective ministerial responsibility, Cabinet solidarity, and the confidentiality of Cabinet deliberations. So collective ministerial responsibility essentially means that Cabinet decisions are binding on each member of Cabinet. So ultimately, when Cabinet makes a decision on matters, ministers must carry out and implement the decision of Cabinet as they relate to their portfolios. And Cabinet solidarity refers to, again, the fact that whilst during Cabinet meetings, ministers are free to speak their positions, have a robust discussion and debate on their positions. But ultimately, once a decision has been made, the expectation of ministers is that they would defend the position of government that's been decided on. And finally, to enable collective ministerial responsibility and Cabinet solidarity, confidentiality of Cabinet deliberations is a really important factor. So matters discussed in Cabinet, as hopefully everyone knows, is Cabinet confidence, and it should not be disclosed or be shared unless it is. It should be shared only on a need-to-know basis, and so that relates to many of the Cabinet documents as well that go to Cabinet. So what kind of matters go to Cabinet for discussion? I've just got a list here, some of the examples. So things like significant new policy proposals. I've mentioned about where there are legislative changes, intergovernmental agreements, where there are high-level appointments across government, and matters that have significant impact on the community. And so again, I'm sure today from the policy community of practice, there are many policy practitioners across government. Whether you're directly involved in Cabinet decisions or Cabinet submissions or not, much of the work that's undertaken by people on this call ultimately lead to some sort of informed position, and you can see how that shapes, I guess, the government's direction as well. I know this can be a little bit dry.
Atsushi,
yep.
Just to give you a flag on timing, you have about 3 minutes to finish up.
Thanks, Lisa. And also, fundamentally, to ensure that ministers do have the proper consultation and are able to make informed decisions, there is a Cabinet submission process that everyone is required to observe. And in this context, timely and thoughtful consultation across both within an agency, but across the sector is really important. And as John mentioned at the start, this is the part where for various teams putting forward positions, whether it's a Cabinet submission or a budget process, which Sam will talk to in more detail, having a consistent view and having consulted within an agency across the sector on priorities is fundamental. And this also involves the early consultation with central agencies, given that the Cabinet Office and Treasury play a quality assurance function for Cabinet submissions that come through. So the Cabinet Office quality assures all the submissions, while Treasury quality assures the Expenditure Review Committee submissions. This is my last slide. So ultimately, TCO's role, so our role in the budget process, we're here to work with the agencies and support them in terms of how to navigate the budget process, as well as being able to discuss with agencies on what are some of the priorities of government. So things like if there's uncertainty around the election commitments, we're here to provide advice around what they are. Also in terms of positioning items as well, and being able to connect the dots in terms of putting forward a case as budget priorities. Our role also involves advising, again, the Premier and the Cabinet once budget proposals come through on which ones we believe from a whole of government perspective should be supported. And we do that in conjunction with New South Wales Treasury and Infrastructure New South Wales. I'll stop there, I'm very conscious of time, and I'll hand over to my colleague, Sam Walker. I'm very happy to take questions at the end of the session as well.
Yep, great, thank you. And we'll drop that link of the New South Wales Cabinet Practice Manual in the chat as well, if we can do that, while Sam loads his slide. Hi, Sam, welcome.
Hello, thank you. Give me 2 seconds to fire my slides up. Great. Can everyone see that and hear me okay? Fantastic. My name is Sam Walker. I'm the Executive Director of Budget Division in the Treasury. That involves, as Louisa says, advising on fiscal policy and the budget process. My team is also responsible for that process that Atsushi touched on there about quality assuring ERC submissions to make sure that they meet the terms of reference for ERC. So I'll talk a bit about budget, I'll talk a bit about ERC through this presentation. Before I get going, I want to acknowledge that I'm here on Gadigal land and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And also acknowledge all the lands where you're joining us from today and any First Nations staff on the call today. It's also very timely to do this. We're concluding the celebration of Treasury's bicentenary this week, and that's been a really rich discussion about the history of Treasury, good and the not so good, and also a really important time to reflect on the impact of the institution on First Nations communities around the world, around the state rather, and the country as a whole. A couple of things that are really important that we've achieved in Treasury over the last few years is we've put a lot of focus into First Nations procurement, and we've also now got an Aboriginal expenditure report which is available on our website. And from that you can see, and for the first time we can see across government how much we spend directly on First Nations specific services, about $1.2 billion, or 1% of total New South Wales expenditure, and we can also see how much gets spent indirectly on First Nations communities, and that's about $5.8 billion across 18 or so service areas. And being able to see that information gives us much more ability to look at where is the money working, where is it not working, where are the kind of wicked problems that we need to advise government and work with agencies to try and resolve. So the presentation today will cover a bit of an overview of the budget, what's different about this budget, some requirements for the budget initiatives this year, which are a bit new, what makes a good ERC submission, and then I'll cover some sources of guidance at the end. And if I don't get to that, I've got a lot of links which we'll send around afterwards, so you'll have that material as well. So one of the reasons I'm really excited about being here today and with this group of people is the budget is fundamentally a decision-making process that brings together the policy and finance professionals across government to give government information they need to make decisions about allocating resources to the things that make the most difference to the community. So bringing this community together is a really exciting event. I hope one, as John says, one that we can continue. We're doing a lot of work in Treasury about upskilling capability across government, both on the financial side, but also more broadly across budget holders. And for us, it's really important that finance is not the realm of Treasury. It's not the realm of finance technicians. Good government finance and sound management of public resources is everyone's role, or whoever has a budget to manage, whether you're spending money on workforces or issuing grants or delivering projects. Good management of that public money is really important, both ensuring that the limited resources that the state has are delivering as much as possible for the community, and that the opportunity cost is well understood by government so that they can allocate resources to the highest impact policies. So a bit about the budget itself. The budget's, as this quote from the OECD says, the budget's a policy document of government showing how annual and multi-annual objectives will be prioritised and achieved. It's also, for us in Treasury, it's a kind of really exciting time because it helps us see how government's aspirations, government's plans are turned into reality. Money is allocated against these programs, and that enables delivery. And it's also a way of the government being transparent with the community about how the resources that are raised through tax, through borrowing, and through other sources are allocated for the delivery of the thing that they've committed to, and management of essential public services. We produce a lot of documentation and a lot of paperwork. In the last budget, we had 4 budget papers and additional 7 documents and glossies and brochures, including a gender impact statement and regional and Western Sydney and overview documents. So 11 publications in all, 1,000 odd pages, around 270,000 words. It's a mammoth effort that really kind of comes together in the last 3 weeks before publication. Boiling all of that down, the most important part of that process, but often the most overlooked, is the appropriation bill. And this is the thing that allows government to seek Parliament's authorisation for the use of public money in the subsequent financial year. So once that's approved by Parliament, then agencies can legally spend money on wages, grants and projects and the like, and without that we wouldn't be able to do that. Alongside that, the remaining products really tell the story of the budget and provide the context for the appropriation bill. Some of that's directed at Parliament to help them understand what they're voting on. Some of it's directed at the media for the more kind of public-facing storytelling, and then a lot of it's also directed at the agency and the public sector to be able to understand what they've been allocated, but also their stakeholders and think tanks and the like to be able to understand what's been allocated to their sectors. Now, one question I get a lot is, why does the budget change every year? And so I'm going to challenge that a little bit and say it doesn't a lot. There is a core cycle of the budget which is reasonably enduring, and I will go on to say why it does change a lot every year. But as a general rule, the rhythm of the budget is relatively stable in a normal year. So starting at the top, 12 o'clock on this diagram, and I'll go for those of you on the call who are not financial professionals, I'll go with the financial year rather than the calendar year. That's how we think in the Treasury. But the first quarter of the financial year, from July to September, is really focused on reviewing, delivering, making sure that everyone's kind of got the budgets they need and managing to those. ERC focuses on reviewing risks and pressures and what's being achieved and kind of thinking about their context ahead of the coming budget. We then, in the second quarter of the year, October to December, really focus on the half year. So that's where we are right now, updating our economic and fiscal forecasts. ERC makes some decisions, but they tend to be fairly limited at this point in the year, and there's no big call for proposals. But there are some things that will inevitably need to be done at that part of the year. January to March then is really about receiving proposals from, I should say in that first quarter, we also aim to get the budget guidance out to agencies so that everyone knows what's being sought and what's being planned for over the course of the year. We've kind of half managed that this year. We've got a lot of the deadlines out, but still a bit of the guidance to come, and that'll tie into the half yearly outcome, which I'll come back to. So January, back to the quarters, January to March is really when we receive the proposals and agencies start to lodge submissions, or ministers rather start to lodge submissions into e-Cabinet for ERC's deliberation in May and June. The deadlines this year, for those who need them or haven't seen them yet, 7th of February is for the proposals to be lodged with Treasury, and then the ERC submissions are all due on the 4th of April. That period then, from April, May until the end of May, is a really intensive period of negotiation, discussion, further fact-finding. As you'd expect with thousands of proposals, there's a lot of desire for more information to understand what's being proposed, how much it costs, why does it cost so much, is it scalable? Equally, there's a huge amount of information for ERC to digest. And a massive amount of cognitive overload for the decision makers through this period as well. So that's really important when we come back to the ERC submissions and setting up those templates. The final thing I'll say here, just around the annual cycle, is we get to the budget, we release the appropriation bill, Parliament assents that, and then we get going again for the next financial year. Alongside this cycle, which is really about the planning cycle, we do have another kind of cycle of managing and monitoring in-year budgets. We will generally always say, once the appropriation bill has been passed, there's no legal route for government to authorise new spending other than going back to Parliament, or in very small cases seeking the approval of the governor, where there's a general kind of a genuine emergency known as an exigency of government. So there are very few scenarios in which the government can reopen that appropriation bill in the year. So we tend to advise government in the majority of cases that their decision making should be focused in that budget year. Make sure you've got your budget set as best as possible at the start of the year. Leave yourself some flexibility in the event of unforeseen crises, but don't expect to be able to just kind of tap additional appropriation through the year as you progress. So that's a really important kind of part of how we organise the decision making with the Expenditure Review Committee, and aside from kind of negotiations with the Commonwealth, industrial awards, contract awards, and then kind of crises like bushfires and floods. We tend to not advise that the government seeks to make financial decisions through the year so that they can look at their trade-offs in that final period. I'm conscious I'm on slide 5 of 18 and have about 10 minutes to go, so I'll try and pick up the speed a little bit. So started by saying the budgets are kind of reasonably typical like that. There are reasons that they differ from year to year. The political cycle is a big one. The election cycle can bring in different timetables, different approaches, and that's what we've seen in the last couple of budgets. Unforeseen events, bushfires, COVID, in recent years have really driven changes to the budget cycle, led to government taking a much more centralised top-down approach to decision making. They wanted to focus resources in some areas, didn't want to consider additional funding in others. And obviously the fiscal and economic cycle also changes the way that the budget is approached by government. The political cycle for this budget is important because the Treasurer has just come in since the election straight into a first budget, almost immediately straight into a second budget, has not had much time to breathe, to be able to digest how he wants the process to run, how he wants to interact with his colleagues and support their decision making. And so this is the first chance he's had in this cycle to really embed that. And so what he's doing through this process is trying to shift the focus away from the relatively loose and open fiscal policy that we had through COVID, where bids were encouraged to try and support the economy and support key priorities of government, to a much tighter focus, better use of existing resources, reprioritisation across existing allocations, and that really brings together the importance of policy and finance working together to understand what's existing allocations. What are the existing allocations achieving? Where might there be opportunities to divert those to things that are higher value or more aligned to government's priorities? So as well as tightening up the budget process, he's really trying to shift the way that we think collectively across the sector about existing allocations and seeking additional funding. The other thing that's really important about this cycle is the fiscal cycle, and this is, I'm afraid, where I've got a few charts. I wouldn't get away with it as a Treasury official without some charts and numbers, but I'll quickly tick through these. Expenses and revenue. So these charts show expenses and revenue in two different ways. On the left-hand side, you've got nominal dollars, and on the right-hand side, we've put expenses and revenue over the size of the economy. So you can see on the left-hand side just the sheer increase in the size of the state in nominal terms or the size of the state's activities rather in nominal terms over the last decade really, and a real ramp up in that size through COVID. One kind of important factor over the dotted period, which is the forward estimate and forecast, is that growth in expenses is forecast to moderate a lot based on current plans. So we're not expecting to see that really fast growth continue, but we've still got a gap between our expenses and revenue. And when we give advice to government about fiscal policy, lots of ways of dressing this up in kind of technical jargon, but fundamentally it's about making sure our current revenue is paying for our current services. And we're still some way from doing that. So no surplus in sight over the forward estimates just yet. And that's a really important kind of measure of our not only our fiscal sustainability, but also the impact we have on the economy, and not trying to be too inflationary, but also being able to build up some buffers. So when we do get hit by those shocks like we did through COVID, we've got the freedom and flexibility to be able to respond effectively to that. On the right-hand side, very quickly, this one shows the same data, but over the economy as the denominator. And what you see here on the face of it is the state returning to about the same level of activity by the end of the forward estimates as we had prior to COVID. But what this doesn't show is the composition of that has changed quite dramatically. If we were to put education, health, and I think transport on here, which together account for a significant proportion of total spending, they're relatively flat as a percentage of GSP over this period, some bumps for COVID. You would see rising of the expense base taken up by interest costs, by workers' compensation, and wages growth as well. And so broadly, that shows that there are some things that are kind of growing as a share of the state. Health and education are relatively stable as a share of GSP, which demonstrates that the kind of forward plans are roughly in their own ways in line with growth in population and price, but everything else is would be getting a bit squeezed through that period as well. And that's why the budget feels quite difficult. But also for education and health, the rising costs, higher demands on the health system and the education system, and rising population also putting pressure on those growth models as well. So there's some really big choices for this budget and future budgets about where does government focus, where does the state government put its resources, and what does it want to prioritise. And again, in terms of implications for the budget and the budget rules, again, it goes back to making sure that recent growth is delivering value, is aligned to government priorities, and managing risks to essential services, and there's very limited capacity for expanding services on new spending without raising taxes or making savings. The second thing we look at is infrastructure investment. And the red line here is a bit of a benchmark. We think 2% of GSP is roughly a good indicator of a sustainable level of infrastructure spending. Much above that, we start to see project slippage and cost escalation as we hit capacity constraints. And then much below that, we're not investing enough as a state to meet the needs for replacing assets and meeting the demands of a growing population. So we think it's a rough benchmark. It's not a hard rule. But you can see from this chart, we've very clearly been above that for a long time, as evidenced in high levels of capital slippage, lots of cost overruns. So the capacity, when we advise the government, the capacity we see is really at the back end of the period and into the planning years. We don't see there being a lot of capacity in the short term without pushing up inflation, pushing up prices, or pushing out project capacity, particularly as public sector infrastructure will be competing with the same labour and resources needed to build houses. And then
Sam, you may have gone on mute. We can't hear you.
I'm back. Can everyone hear me and see me?
Yes,
great. Sorry, I paused momentarily. Thought joys of Teams. The weak operating position and a large infrastructure program, we're effectively borrowing for that infrastructure. We don't have a lot of surplus cash to put towards infrastructure, so the majority or increasing share of that infrastructure program is funded by debt, and that in turn pushes our debt up. And again, some kind of pretty stark numbers there. What matters less than the total scale of debt really is our ability to service that debt. So we look at it as a percentage of GSP or as a percentage of revenue. And the Treasurer is kind of anchored on his pre-election commitment to maintain gross debt around 188 billion, which equates to about 20% of GSP. So again, kind of being guided by that, there's not a lot of capacity to increase debt through this budget without there being some sort of offset within existing programs, existing activities, or raising revenue elsewhere, which obviously has its own challenges in the cost of living environment as well. So all of that, I've got 2 minutes, so I'm probably going to drop a section, but I'll leave you with some links. All of that kind of guides where the Treasurer's going with the budget rules. And the way the government wants to set up the decision-making cycle for the budget. A big change to this budget process is a lot of the proposals will be considered together in ministerial budget submissions as a whole. We previously had different things going off in different directions, but material cost variations and new measures and savings will all come together through individual ministerial submissions. With a few exceptions at the margins. So this doesn't apply necessarily to people like the integrity agencies who have their own budget process. But for the majority of general government agencies, the majority of proposals will be considered through these ministerial budget submissions. Cost variations for existing programs will need to be endorsed by ministers, and we'll need to put forward options to mitigate those costs, including changing existing policy settings. And this is really the means for government to consider whether those legacy policy settings are the right ones. Do they want to actively endorse those, or think about something new that costs a bit less? And then alongside that, ERC will be considering new measures and savings put forward by ministers. Those will be within what the Treasurer's called growth allowances. We're still working the detail of that through with him and with the Cabinet, so there's not a lot more I can say on that at this point, but effectively that'll be a constraint on the amount that can be proposed without offsets as well. So in that environment, very kind of limited capacity for new ideas and new measures, but also a real emphasis on quality evidence as well, to make sure that those things being put forward are really high value and will kind of turn the dial on the things that the government is trying to achieve. I'll skip this slide because I want to get to a few other things, but I'll just say that there is a lot of guidance in this pack around how that evidence comes together. It can appear quite a lot of material, but there's some work being done in the background and some guidance is about to be issued that streamlines some of that. A lot of that is going to this question of quality. So we don't just manage the dollars, we want to manage the value of what's being achieved. And so a lot of the guidance that supports the business cases and the cost benefit analysis goes to giving government that confidence that the proposals they're considering fit with their strategic objectives, have a measurable and demonstrable impact on social welfare. They have scalable options that can be delivered, and that the costings are kind of well understood and robust, and then that the agency and the market as a whole have the capacity to deliver these things as well. So a lot of that evidence goes to talking that through. Very quickly on what makes a good ERC submission, and Atsushi's guidance kind of really covers it. Timely submission lodgement, also very early engagement with Treasury and with finance teams really makes a difference. The biggest stuff-ups and hiccups that we encounter are where a submission has been rushed in, there's not been time to engage with a finance team or with a Treasury team, and the costings don't match the decisions, and it's all a bit of a nightmare to unravel. So early engagement is really positive. Just some reflections from me looking at submissions. Be very clear about what you're seeking approval for. Don't fill out your recommendations with noting recommendations. Tell the story through the submission, not through the recommendations. Make sure the recommendations align with the financial impact statement. Do please stick to the template and the attachment formats. As I mentioned, there's a lot of cognitive overload in ERC, so the more that we can present the information to them in consistent ways, the better they can digest that information. And again, they're kind of engaged early with finance teams, and we can help, and with Treasury and Cabinet liaison teams, we can help make sure that the hygiene of these submissions is well developed. I'll quickly whip through my final section. I'm 2 minutes over. Sorry, Louisa. So we've launched a new New South Wales Budget Agency information portal. You can get access to it, and we'll send these around, but you can get access to it by emailing us. This is really a one-stop shop that contains links to all the other things I'm about to go through. And we're also in the process of launching consolidated budget management guidance, and this is really aimed at those non-finance teams, the budget holders, the senior leaders across government who have big budgets to manage, and tries to kind of demystify some of their obligations and responsibilities. A lot of ERC guidance material that Atsushi also called out. I just give a plug for the FIS generator and the short form submission that helps people writing submissions to structure their thinking and get the costings in a good format for the submissions. Updated business case templates coming soon, but all available on that link. And then there's other guidance there on cost benefit tools and the gender and First Nations impact frameworks as well. The final thing from me is that we have a public submission portal that's now open until the 17th of December. So for anyone who's not in the New South Wales public sector who has made it this far on the presentation, that's your opportunity to provide some input into the budget process. But those in the New South Wales public sector, feel free to share that with your stakeholders. And we're really keen to kind of get public submissions into that as well. And then we are doing some work in the background on improving Prime. So this one's aimed at the finance teams. We've got a survey that's live at the moment. So again, click on that link and you'll be able to give us your input into your pain points, and we will do our best to address them. The final thing for me is that part of our bicentenary celebrations, someone's dug out a quote from Michael Egan that said that many see New South Wales Treasury as being a dismal, blunt, fiendish, and at times obscure steward of the state's financial resources. I hope we're certainly not fiendish. We're sometimes obscure, probably a little bit dismal and blunt, but I hope that's clarified things. I'm really happy to take questions and take my breath.
Thank you, Sam, and what a terrific quote you've managed to dig out, and congratulations on your celebration. We're going to have questions now from our audience, and if you haven't participated in one of these before, this is normal for us in the policy community of practice. We do like to see your questions in advance, so if you could put your questions in the chat, and then I can hopefully coordinate the order of questions to our speakers. And we do look like we're getting a few questions in, so we'll try and get through as many as possible. Our first question is from Susie. Susie, I can see you there. So you've managed the first steps of turning your camera on. Would you like to introduce yourself and then ask your question?
Yes, thank you so much for this. I found it really interesting, and I'm really appreciative of the government and Treasury's work in the Aboriginal space with the investment frameworks and all of that support work recently. It's really nice to see. I work in Water for the Environment branch down in BCS, and we do a lot of First Nations work. But how are those actual procurements and stuff recorded and kind of collected up into that expenditure report? Like, how can we make sure that when we work with First Nations suppliers and sitting fees and all of those bits and pieces are actually like recorded up into the proper processes?
I'm going to apologise. I'm probably not the right person for that question, but I will dig out the guidance, and if I get your contact details, I'll flick that on to you. Sure, thank you.
I have a follow-up question that's somewhat related to that. The government's got a focus on closing the gap at the moment. One of the other things I've seen is that some budget proposals that would aim to support Aboriginal people often fall between portfolio areas. It seems often that our best luck through the budget process comes from having a sound CBA and the strong support from our ministers. But when the proposals fall between portfolios, it sometimes struggles to get a hearing. Sam or Atsushi, is there any move towards better focus on some of the key issues where there is a cross-portfolio interest, particularly, or as an example, with budget proposals relating to Aboriginal people?
Do you want me to take a first stab? So yes, there is, and that's one we're particularly aware of in the design of the budget process. In recent years, there has been an explicit submission alongside the portfolio submissions around closing the gap to try and funnel all of these proposals into one decision-making pipeline. It's probably too soon to confirm exactly how it'll work for this budget cycle, but it's certainly something we're very aware of and very active in discussing in Treasury.
And something that we at TCO are discussing with Sam and Treasury about right now.
Excellent. Peter, would you like to come on and ask your question? I think I saw it earlier. We have a few questions on some of the charts that you showed. Sam?
Yeah, thanks, Louisa. Good morning. Sam, thanks for your presentation and the charts that you popped up. They were really interesting long-term trend charts. You mentioned, I think, that you're trying to avoid capital expenditure greater than, I think, was it 2% GSP?
Yeah. I use that as a benchmark, not necessarily avoid it, but that's the kind of benchmark we look at. Yeah.
Sure. I was just interested, the years where it had exceeded that significantly was about the same time that I think we'd done the sort of the sale of the poles and wires. It's a little bit off topic, but I'm just interested in the observation. Did the poles and wires not fully cover that expenditure splurge?
It's covered some of it. So we've gone from I characterize it over the last 8 years or so. We've gone from a phase of the poles and wires sale through restart, covering a lot of the infrastructure costs, through to borrowing, and borrowing being more of a driver or more of a funding source for those infrastructure projects, and that's off the back of a weaker operating position than previously expected, but also really significant mega projects being delivered over the last 6 to 8 years. So all the kind of metro lines, light rails, these things are kind of multi-year intergenerational investments, which naturally kind of push us above that steady state investment trajectory that's illustrated by the 2% of GSP.
Thank you.
I think that might have answered Luke's question as well. So we might go on to Liz. fascinating to hear that there is a public process to contribute to budget. I've never heard of that before, so very exciting to find that out. Liz, over to you for your question. Don't forget to introduce yourself and where you're from.
Thanks, Sam. Liz Gould from the Cabinet Office, and thanks, Sam. That was a really informative presentation. My question is probably more of a process one than a technical question, and I guess this, alongside the submissions that agencies are making each year as part of the budget process, I'm wondering how public submissions considered by Treasury and the Treasurer as part of this process.
Thanks, Liz. That's a really, really good question. So, and we have done this for a number of years. It's just not been very well publicised. So we're giving that a push this year. So that's probably the real big difference. And it's not been done quite so early. We tend to have done it much later in the process, so it's less effective. But these, so when we say submissions, they're not kind of formal submissions into Cabinet saying government should spend this much money on these things, but they're I guess, an input into the ministerial discussions. So the public submissions would generally be from stakeholders, think tanks and the like, and they would come into the Treasury. We give them to the Treasurer's office, who then pass them on to the ministers responsible for the areas within the submissions. And then that forms part of the discussions they then have at the ministerial level about what to prioritise and what to try and push. It may be that they're not all going to inform the immediate budget process, but kind of subsequent budget cycles as well. It's very, if there are kind of big novel ideas in these things, it can be very hard to turn them around straight into the budget process as a whole. So we're kind of building a bit of a rhythm of this with the new government, and trying to make sure that they have a better direct input from those groups. But it's not a kind of very automatic route into the cabinet room in May.
Thank you. It's helpful.
And that's fascinating. I'm really interested to hear that. Always a dilemma, I think, in notifying our stakeholders about opportunity for public contribution, because then we get a whole lot of questions that we then have to respond to. But I think it's very important for government to hear back from the community about what things should be funded in budget cycles. So very excited to hear about that, and we'll definitely be letting a few people know. And we now have a question from Stephanie Callanan. If you'd like to come on, thank you.
Morning, and thank you, Sam, so much for your presentation. That was super insightful, and I'll be taking some notes back to our team. I just had a question around program evaluation and independent evaluation, back to your mention of needing to constantly sell to government the strategic fit, that things are working, the evidence, the need for sort of reinvestment to continue developing certain services and programs. But independent evaluation can be quite costly, not just in terms of the cost for the service provider, but also the time and the labour involved in staff within government partnering. And then also there can be quite a lengthy process for evaluation, depending on the type of research methods, etc. And yet we've got such a tight budget cycle in terms of being able to demonstrate the effectiveness of pilots or programs. What's Treasury's view on this, and how do we kind of make this work, or what have you seen work well in this space?
It's a really good question. Again, I'm afraid I'm not the kind of subject matter expert for Treasury on this. We do definitely think about that, and I kind of expand the question to apply to business cases too. We've observed, and the government has observed as well, that kind of proliferation of business cases that are a bit disproportionate to the scale of investment being sought, and I suspect your question applies to those as well. The government's focus has been really on kind of streamlining the business case process. I'm not that close to what's being done on the evaluation side, but it is certainly something that teams in Treasury kind of focus on and kind of intend to be proportionate to the scale of investment. That said, we're asking for, in terms of kind of the cabinet submission process, recognise there's a lot of kind of lead into these kind of small bits of paper that go into ERC, but there is a kind of appetite from ERC to, you know, these big dollars being considered, to know that things are working and to know that they're kind of backed by evidence as well. Sorry, it's a bit of a kind of long-winded half answer to say that we do think about it, but I'm not quite sure the exact mechanism for how that translates into the policy.
And there has
that's
been
helpful.
There has been some streamlining of advice or recommendations from Treasury recently on cost benefit and analyses that are done for budget bids as well, which is tremendously helpful in terms of streamlining that process, so that we spend more money on delivery and less on making the case. But obviously the good evidence base behind what we're proposing is also valuable. Had a really interesting question from Lucinda. So we might ask Lucinda to ask her question. Relates to both TCO and Treasury working together.
Hello, I'm not sure if you can see me.
Yes.
Sorry, we've got these new cameras at Treasury. Hi, I have a question about how TCO and Treasury work together. I work in Treasury, and we lose a lot of people to TCO because it seems like they have these teams which kind of exist in both spaces. So I guess what's the benefit of having these teams in both offices, and how do they work together?
I'm happy to go first, Sam. So very much we do work with Treasury, as you know, Lucinda. In many ways, I think having differences in opinion is a healthy policy-making process, particularly where there might be slight difference in focuses around Treasury and the Treasurer's kind of priorities and what they might focus on versus TCO and the Premier's focus. And so obviously not speaking for Treasury, but naturally with many submissions there's a strong focus on the budget position and financial impacts. TCO really cares about that, given that that is a whole of government consideration, but there may be broader considerations that TCO might focus on a little bit more that ultimately lead to slight differences in perspectives. But one way or another, what we do try to do is make sure that the other party is aware of that position that we might be putting forward as part of a cabinet advice process, so that again, as much as possible, we have an understanding of that position that Treasury might put forward, and we would communicate our position as well, so that there's no surprises whenever Cabinet gets together and has discussion on policy proposals.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, and I think that there's been a rebuilding of the TCO policy functions in the last couple of years, which we've certainly missed in Treasury, because it's a good kind of counterpoint to us, where we kind of focus a little bit more on the finance and the economics alongside the policy, but the TCO counterpoint's been really useful. We do also both provide direct input and advice into ERC submissions. So we put every submission has a Treasury advice and a TCO blue on it, and the cabinet see those side by side. And as they're going through the decisions, they look at, you know, what's TCO recommending, what's Treasury recommending. Are they agreed? And if they're aligned, that's a really powerful message, and if they're not aligned, then that teases out some of the tensions in the discussions. So that's a really powerful mechanism in the cabinet conversations too.
Thank you.
I have one question I've been wanting to ask, and then we'll finish up. Sam, you mentioned FISs, the financial impact statement. Can you give us a few tips on what you're really looking for in that section of a cabinet submission?
That's a great callback to a bit of the slide that I skipped over because I ran out of time. So thank you. Really the FIS is there to tell ERC how much the thing they're about to approve costs. So at a very kind of basic level, it should include the full cost of the proposal. And if that's a capital project, that includes depreciation, includes maintenance, operating costs over the lifetime of the proposal as well. So one kind of common thing we see is that submissions put forward a cost for the single year because that's the budget, but actually it's got a really long tail of costs, or it misses off the depreciation. So we'll always pick that kind of thing up and say, you know, if you're committing to a project that's going to take 10 years, you need a 10-year cost in there. or if you're committing to ongoing funding, you have to recognise that every year, not just recognise the first year of it and hope for the best. Some kind of common things that we pick up in the submissions is that going back to that point about appropriations, sometimes they miss a legal source of funding for the current year. So if there's a proposal for the current year, that needs to come with how it's going to be funded from existing appropriations, or flag if it needs to go back to Parliament or the Governor. The recommendations and the FIS should both reflect the Minister's preferred option. It's very difficult to put options in FISs, and we take that into the decision, so preferred option is best. New measures should be for approval, not for noting, and that helps the recommendations match to the financial impacts. Capital measures should include depreciation, and then it should be general government impacts only. So ERC doesn't want to know so much about the impacts on kind of transfers between agencies and payments within the public sector. They want to know what's the impacts on the overall state, and that in our kind of technical terms, that's eliminated at the general government level. So to see the overall fiscal impact.
Thanks, Sam. We're at time, and I did commit to having us closed out at 11. So, John, over to you for a few final words. Thanks.
Yeah, very quick. That was a fantastic session. Thank you. I work in T Corp, Treasury Corporation, so I wonder if there's interest perhaps in doing a joint event next year, which looks at where the money comes from. As this is going to be our final Community of Finance Professionals event for the year, I'd quite quickly like to thank all the hard work done by our advisory board, especially call out for our board member Nadia Theo for her fantastic work in putting together today's event. Importantly as well, thank you for all our support of our members. On behalf of Treasury, fill in that Prime survey. They'll use the data. We're looking forward to an even bigger year next year. I hope everyone has a wonderful, safe break, and I look forward to seeing everyone in the new year. Thank you.
Thanks. And I'd also like to thank Nadia, John, Gary, Sandra for organising today, and our speakers, Sam and Atsushi. What a fantastic event. We've had over 500 people participating, which is really great. And it's also the Policy Community of Practice's last webinar for the year. So we'll be back in February next year. And until then, have a happy and safe festive season. And thank you for your interest and enthusiasm in policy. Thank you.